Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hope you're having a great day, a great week. Last week we kind of went through sort of media analysis, George Gerbner, kind of more cultural studies kind of components looking at the text and doing some sort of work around that on representation. So hopefully you enjoyed that. Yeah, it's kind of great, fascinating stuff. This week we move on to music and also kind of more on the reception side. So if you remember back, sort of the Contemporary Center of Cultural Studies, the Birmingham School, focus on three elements, right? And I've said these many times, but I think the importance of sort of restating them, just to keep those in our mind. One of them is the production of culture, which is the political economy, the organization of culture industries. The second component is the text, the image, the lyrics in this case, as well as images if you start getting into videos, music videos and things like that. And then finally, audience reception, sort of the meaning that people attach to the text itself. And in this case, it's a lot on audience reception and also on a little bit some different elements that I think in this video I'll kind of share kind of what's going on. So the overall kind of thing here is we're looking at music forms that once they are developed, they come into a historical setting, a particular context, that we have to understand that element of culture, in this case music, it's not only its origins or its beginnings, but it's also its historical context around which that music is occurring, if that makes sense. So it's not just the music form, it's the music form within a historical, social, cultural context. And it's that context that sometimes shapes the meaning that people give to that particular cultural form. So, if we could look at today, right, it took a period of time. So, but in jazz, the history of jazz, early reception of jazz, there was a lot of reaction against jazz. A lot of what we've identified today as very racist orientations or very racist perspectives from the white community about jazz, and those receptions were a byproduct of that particular time period of a lot of things that were going on historically. Some of that is shared in the article, some of it is not, and I'll probably try to share a little bit of that context here in this video. So those music forms come about in a particular historical, cultural, social context. That context and an audience demographic, the white middle class, let's say, in the reception to jazz, the white middle class has a reaction to it, a response to it. So that demographic is part of that audience reception, right? Is an important component. So what we do is we're looking at, in this case, I like this juxtaposition between jazz and rap in the 1980s. So jazz in the 1920s, rap in the 1980s, 1990s. So two different historical time periods, two different contexts, but there's a consistent theme across both those things. So it's this sort of comparative examination kind of component. And that's sort of the goal and objective, I think, of these readings and sort of the write-up for these is to examine some of those commonalities between those two different historical time periods and these different art forms, and also to start to unpackage a little bit sort of what may be going on, what may be shaping the audience reception, and where that audience reception kind of originates and where it comes from. Okay, so let's talk about both articles, kind of give a little bit of an overview, some background information about both of them. Let's start off with the first article, The White Reception of Jazz in America, and kind of walk through some different components of that. So the more you are a student of history, the more I think you can gain appreciation for this particular article and sort of what was going on in that time period and the inception and the reaction to jazz music. So there's no way we can kind of recount the whole racial history of the early 1900s. But I encourage you to look up just a quick search on the Red Summer of 1919, for example. There's some great short videos. I'll try to include a couple of those links within the week's folder for you to kind of get situated in that sort of idea. 1914, the birth of the nation, D.W. Griffith. I mean, that is sort of this film that's oftentimes identified as this film that's promoting very particular ideas of dangers and threats from the black community. So it's this film that's propaganda that's supporting white supremacy and sort of foundational or an influence on the development of the KKK or reinvigoration of the KKK. And this is in 1914. So it's a silent film. It's one of the first films, major film, right? It's actually shown at the White House during that time period after its release. And this film starts, it enters in people's hearts and minds, in terms of as an audience. And this film is a reaction to post-Reconstruction. After the Civil War, blacks gaining greater access to resources, and for a short period of time, actually occupying political positions in the South until the federal government basically removed kind of the troops from the South. And then we sort of start to develop Jim Crow South and Jim Crow South laws and rules and regulations and all that kind of stuff. So this is the time period, right? So it's a time period of kind of a rise of white supremacy, and then also a migration of blacks out of the South that are moving to the North for industries, war industries, and other industries related to the war in the 1910s, and then other industries, for sure, manufacturing is developing, all these different kind of things. So it's this movement of blacks out of the South in part, and also the Harlem Renaissance. Sort of new art forms and direction, and sort of the black community is getting a stronger voice. And in addition, sort of some marching or some activism around civil rights. Also during that time period, there's a concern about, called scientific racism or social Darwinism. The idea of eugenics becomes pretty powerful. This idea about eugenics of good genes, you meaning good, genetics, genes, that there are good genes, and that we need to make sure that the good genes become part of our overall gene pool in the United States or in a nation, a country, for the survival of that nation itself. So we identify these today as scientific racism, these idea of eugenics that societies become stronger if the good genes, and good meaning a white middle class genes, upper middle class genes, that these are the genes that need to be reproduced and brought into our gene pool to make the society stronger. I mean, we associate that with Hitler, right? We associate that with the rise of that domination in Nazi Germany. These are ideas that are percolating and building up in the United States. Cold Springs Harbor, New York is a centerpiece or foundational organization. A lot of organizations and scientists sort of producing this work. So Americans are caught in this sort of thing. It's during this time period of belief that if you have this belief that about eugenics and you're developing these ideas, you also now have a fear that if a white person and a black person actually have sexual relations and they procreate, this could be problematic. This is the belief during that particular time period for some. And so the term miscegenation, the mixing of races, there are laws that are being passed that are prohibiting the mixing of races, anti-miscegenation laws. And it wasn't until 1967, in the case of Loving versus Virginia, that from a national level, that we stopped prohibiting interracial marriages in the United States. So let's just give you a few different historical pieces of information, try to contextualize that a little bit. I mean, we're talking about, it's a pretty dynamic time period when jazz is introduced. And these reactions, identifying it as savage and primitive, I think you have to put yourself in that time period to sort of understand that. And then it raises all kinds of questions, I think, in that article from Anderson about this sort of reception of jazz, that it's these receptions are reinforcing these ideas of racism, these racist ideas or white supremacist ideas that are going on in that particular time period. Okay, so that's a little bit about that first article on white reception in America. Now, kind of talk a little bit about constructing racial rhetoric, the Bender article, a phenomenal article, fascinating, kind of recounting or doing a sort of comparative example of two different music forms that are in this time period, that there's a concern from Tipper Gore and the Parents Music Resource Center that gets established in the 1980s, the Washington Wives, who have this sort of concern about these music forms. And what Bender does is this comparative, looking at where she makes a statement that heavy metal and rap provide comparative cases for examining how the mass media serve as an ideological tool. So in other words, that the mass media serves as an instrument or as a mechanism which ideology, beliefs get communicated to the general population. And ideology is powerful if you kind of go back to the ideas we mentioned before about the Frankfurt School or the Birmingham School, that the sort of idea that mass media is a powerful vehicle to influence and control ideologies within society. And so her example or her comparative case example or examination is this sort of investigation into ideology and how the reception about or the reaction to heavy metal and rap and the different reactions have a lot to do with reinforcing particular ideologies within our nation. So we kind of talk a little bit about a couple things that she's doing here. There's a couple different elements I think are really important about doing this kind of work that she's doing. One of them is that she focuses a lot on framing, about how something is framed, right? So there's choices to be made when an event happens. Any event happens, right? We have to frame it. Just like you're taking a picture. You're with a bunch of friends, you're out somewhere, take a picture and everybody's posing, right? Or not posing, whatever it is. You're trying to frame the moment. And that framing, there's a lot of history, a lot of theory behind this. She mentions or cites Clifford Geertz, a anthropologist who investigates this idea of framing or provides a lot of foundational work around this area. But that framing and how we frame is related to cultural ideologies and beliefs themselves. So what we choose to focus on and how we focus on them is a reflection of dominant culture itself. And so framing isn't something that just happens natural or just sort of intuitive. It's something that we're socialized, or how we've been socialized in the world of socialization influences, the frames that we select, the frames that we choose, the frames that we identify, right? And so here's a quote from the article, is that the news media's impact is not so much the result of outright statements about what audience are to believe, but rather comes from the selection and application of cultural lenses through which events are portrayed. To examine how the media influences audience perceptions, the codes the media use to frame public discussions, events, or objects must be examined. And that's really her investigation, is looking at the frames, looking at kind of the frames, looking at how the mass media responded to these two different music forms. She doesn't deny that there wasn't some difference in terms of the text, but her argument is that the difference in the text is that difference alone is not sufficient to explain the difference in terms of the reception from the media. And the framing becomes really important to sort of examine this she goes through looking at the different types of frames, the effects of framing themselves, and it becomes really, really powerful in terms of trying to illustrate that these frames are a reflection of racial relations in the United States and racial ideologies in the United States during this particular time period, and they reinforce that sort of racial framework in the United States at that time as well. Let me kind of end before giving you kind of the question for the week, but the final quote I thought is really powerful near the end of the article, the last paragraph. She says, "Yet the discourse about these cultural objects reflected not only the symbolic meanings residing in the objects themselves, but also the social context in which the objects were produced and received." So the discourse, the language, the discussion, the narrative that we had about these cultural objects, it wasn't in the objects themselves, right? Or not only within the objects themselves, but also it's about the context and about the meaning within that context. So kind of like that kind of work. And I think it provides a great example of what, in this area of cultural studies, why it's so powerful and important, because these ideologies of race or class or gender or sexual orientation or gender identity or all these things get expressed through culture. So we examine culture so we can understand those things better. Okay, so the question for this week I want you to answer, and you can put it right at the start of your paper for the week, is the question of why these reactions, right? There's no really right or wrong answer, but I just want you to provide me just sort of, 200, 300 words and just describe Why do you think these reactions existed for jazz and for rap? All right, with that, have a great week. Enjoy the readings. We're nearing the end of the term. You all are doing great. Appreciate all that you're doing. Have yourself a fabulous day, and I'll check in with you next week.